My name is Cathy St. Germans, and I'd like to welcome you all to this session entitled Seaweed is Already Saving the World. Seaweed has been part of human culture, part of human diet, and part of human medicine for at least millennia. With this in mind, we're here today to gain intertidality with a panel of wild seaweed harvesters, marine biologists, small-scale seaweed mariculturalists, and a chef and seaweed forager, to look at the place where the land meets the ocean, to recognise the fragility of that environment, and to take a look beneath the surface of our wild coastal ecosystems and economies. We will dive into the littoral zone to cover Algae 101. We will talk about where seaweed sits in the culinary tradition of the people of Ireland. We will share information on the global supply chains and seaweed workers and learn from each other and about how to support biodiverse, economically sustainable coastal communities, cultural vitality, and climate change resilience along our fragile and beautiful shores. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to our wonderful panel. This session was convened by the Greenhorns, which is led by the glorious Severine, who's amazing. She's a farmer and organiser based in Down East Maine. And along with her husband, Taran, she runs Severine Farm, an MOFGA certified organic, diverse agroforestry operation and fruit orchard. She's a founder and director of the Greenhorns, a grassroots organisation best known for the New Farmers Almanac, which if you don't subscribe to it or have back copies, I urge you to do so. It's one of the organisation's current projects is Seaweed Commons, an international learning and advocacy network for conservation-minded seaweed farmers, wild harvesters, marine biologists, and researchers. And the Commons paper position paper will be added to the chat. Also joining us today is Amanda Swinimer. Amanda is a seaweed harvester, author, business owner, and educator who lives and works on the west coast of Vancouver Island in Canada, where she is today. She began her own business, Tscharner Tidal Wilds, in 2003, hand harvesting wild edible seaweed from the beaches and kelp forests surrounding her home. Her expertise is unique and makes her a sought-after speaker at international conferences, speaking about the ecological importance of seaweeds and the extraordinary health benefits. She has been conducting seaweed workshops and tours, as well as teaching young people in the British Columbia school system for years, passing on her rare knowledge and sharing her intensely joyful ocean with diverse audiences. She holds a BSc in marine biology and is the author of The Science and Spirit of Seaweed, Discovering Food, Medicine and Purpose in the Kelp Forests of the Pacific Northwest. Welcome, Amanda. And sitting next to me, which is and fresh off the main hall stage. She's run to this building, which is a very beautiful building next to Jesus College in Oxford, is Darina Allen. Somebody who, as Dan Saladino just said, has done more to make people aware of food and farming than virtually anyone in her lifetime. You've done a great deal. Darina is a well-known chef, author and presenter, and is co-founder of Ballymaloe Cookery School, a sustainable farm-to-table project situated on a 100-acre organic farm in East Cork, Ireland. The family hotel Ballymaloe House has been the recipient of numerous awards for its seasonal, local and homegrown food and hospitality. Darina has also been instrumental in setting up the farmers' market movement in Ireland and is president of East Cork Convivium of Slow Food. And we also hopefully will have with us Sean Barrett, who is a lifelong fisherman and conservationist, and we're hoping he's going to join us for Montauk. So that hopefully will appear before long. And I'm Catherine St. Germans. I'm a journalist, co-founder and director of the Port Eliot Festival, co-founder and director of Farms to Feed Us, and organizer of the Regenerative Agriculture Gatherings. So welcome everyone, far and wide. And I'd like to start off by asking Severine, please, could you guide us into this amazing ecosystem and community of algae around the world?
Thank you so much, Cathy, and all of you. I was lucky enough to go to Darina's cookery school in Ireland and was taken to the beach and introduced to the seaweed, and it has changed my life. And so now I'm on the other side of the Atlantic, and I met Darina at a slow food event, and that's why I went to the cookery school, and also met Amanda Swinimer. So a big hats off to Slow Food and Slow Fish for providing the cultural container that we can have this conversation inside of. And of course, thanks to the Oxford Real Farming Conference, whose principled and expansive vision of agroecology, its social context, for food sovereignty and self-determination, resilience, and regenerative agriculture, I think will carry us forward into this coming century quite well. So much of what this community believes in can find its expression also in the sea, in our interaction with the sea. So just if you think you're a terrestrialist, know that if you're part of this community, you already have a lot of insight to bring to what we're going to go through today, which is a lot of loving and a lot of information and very visual information to cover a lot of ground. So we're going to hurry with love into the world of seaweed. And both Amanda and Darina and also Sean are signatories of the seaweed. We can go into the slides. Can you see the shore? So this is the intertidal area we're going to be focusing our energy on. And Amanda these are 22-foot tides where I live in Maine. And so when the tide goes out, the seaweed is revealed. And when tide comes in, the seaweed is underwater again.
Hey, Severine, you expand your screen.
Yeah, can you put it full screen, Sev?
I think I could. How's that?
Not yet.
There it is. Perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah. Gorgeous. Beautiful.
Great. Okay, and so now the point also to make, thank you to the wonderful dairy cooperative in the US called Organic Valley, who value seaweed as a nutritional input in dairy cows and who are interested to make sure that the conversation of seaweed sustainability reaches more agricultural audiences. So this is part of a series with support from them. So next slide. Oh, I can do the slides even. Oh my gosh, we're really advanced here. But no, I can't.
You can do it.
I want to. Ay.
Daniel says you should be able to.
Can you tell me where to click?
Use the arrow key. The arrow keys on the screen of the pictures. Possibly.
This is why I should never be in charge.
You'll do it.
Can you see another picture?
Yep.
Okay, so here you can see a little bit closer up the beautiful saccharina, the beautiful sugar kelp, and of course the awkwardness and excitement of people interacting with this wild ecosystem. So I just would say to all of you who get excited by this presentation today, you can read online the Seaweed Commons position paper and meet some of the signatories here on the screen. A big and growing chorus of people whose love of seaweed causes us to issue this paper and urge care and consideration in this process of rulemaking, because we are all citizens, and therefore we are co-owners, co-stewards of the public trust waters. The waters are in fact managed by the state in a public trust for all of us. So we many more of us need to raise our voices. So I'm going to go over to Amanda, and she's going to cover the 101 of algal evolution and habitat as a primary producer in the ocean. Amanda, are you ready?
I am. Thank you, Severine. So these photos that you see in the slide are photos of my office. I've been wild harvesting different kinds of kelp for the last 20 years. And in particular, these photos were taken in a bull kelp forest where I sustainably harvest bull kelp in a way where the bull kelp will regenerate. But I'm just going to shift and give a basic algae seaweed 101 just to sort of put the place of algae and seaweed into the greater global situation, and also just to give a brief definition of what we're talking about, because describing seaweed and algae is not so simple as other perhaps biological groups. So seaweeds belong to a larger group of organisms known as algae, and algae range from single-celled photosynthesizing, basically like a bacteria type of cell, all the way up to these giant kelps that you see in the slide. And as a group, algae are arguably the most important group of organisms on the planet. They provide an estimated 50 to 80% of global oxygen. They absorb about 1/3 of atmospheric carbon dioxide, and they are also the primary producers of the largest ecosystem on Earth, the ocean. So incredibly valuable group of organisms. When I'm talking about providing all this oxygen and absorbing all the carbon dioxide, that's mainly is the microalgae that's doing the lion's share of that, which are the single-celled, almost like a bacteria type of photosynthesizing organism. So when we talk about seaweeds, we're talking about marine macroalgae. So seaweeds are multicellular. They sort of resemble plants, but they're also incredibly diverse. So we have types. We have three main types of seaweed groups. We have the red seaweeds and the green seaweeds, which are in the plant kingdom. And then we have the brown seaweeds, which are in kingdom Chromista. Now, within the brown seaweed group are seaweeds known as kelp. The technical definition of a kelp is that they are in the order Laminarials, but the simple way of remembering what a kelp is that they are the really big brown seaweeds. That's the easier definition. And kelp are really significant within macroalgae or within seaweeds. So kelp form in about a quarter of the world's coastlines. Upward growing kelp form an ecosystem called a kelp forest. And kelp forests are among the most productive and biodiverse ecosystems in the world. Kelp are incredibly fast growing. Bull kelp, for example, the second largest seaweed on the planet, is one of the fastest growing organisms on the planet. It can grow more than 30 meters in about 6 months' time. So incredibly productive, incredibly diverse. And it's estimated that kelp forest ecosystems are declining at an annual rate of about 2% per year. There are a number of reasons for this, but a phycologist is a biologist who studies algae. Phycologists point to an increased incidence of marine heat waves or climate change as the most significant driver for this global decline. So backing up again to the microalgae, we have current day microalgae called cyanobacteria. There are records of a cyanobacteria very similar to today's cyanobacteria from 1.9 billion years ago. It's thought that this was the first life form. So we have this single-celled bacteria capturing energy from the sun, releasing oxygen, producing carbon, and in this way helped create an environment on Earth that could nourish life. So in this way, algae spun the web of life that we see on Earth today. So just an incredibly significant group of organisms, the algae. The other one of the other considerations when sort of thinking of the whole health of the whole Earth is that algae are also involved in cloud formation, which is a critical process in regulating global climate. When certain single-celled algae cells are damaged or die, they release a chemical that breaks down into dimethyl sulfide, which is the most abundant biological sulfur in the atmosphere. And this reacts with oxygen to produce aerosol sulfates, and those act as nuclei for cloud formation. Seaweeds, the macroalgae as well, can help lower the acidity of the water in the area where they're growing. So they are often, seaweeds are encouraged to grow in oyster farms and things like that to help some of these species that are really sensitive to ocean acidification to help them adapt a bit better. So that is sort of a very quick overview of the global ecological role of algae and its history in basically helping life to exist on Earth, creating this foundational nourishment for all the life we see today. So I'll turn it back over to Severine.
Unmute. Severine? Severine, you're muted.
Can you see the slide? So here you
unmuted
see.
yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
So now Severine's
Okay.
going to
So
carry
now
on.
I'm going to introduce Darina because she's going to tell us about the North Atlantic seashore where she lives and the cultural traditions of eating kelps. Just to say, they're mostly, as you can see in the tops and bottoms of the world, they're not as much of the kelp forests in the tropical waters. The browns are up and the reds are more tropical. But just so you know, there's extreme amounts of diversity that exists. So from Newfoundland as a primary producer, providing habitat, shelter, shade, substrate, and surface for these tunicates and snails and relatives of sea anemone. In Chile, long strappy ones, again, buffering the shores of the rocky cliffs. And even here in Ireland, and I made a slide because I didn't know about Darina's slide. But now we're going to go to Darina's slides, and she will tell us what goes on in Ireland. I see a lot of redheads in that picture.
That's Ballyandreen. I'm not sure if you recognize it. Probably that's one of the places we took you foraging on the first. And I'm so excited to hear that was one of the things that ignited your passion for seaweed. Ireland, as you know, is an island nation with the long coastline, and we have over 600 seaweeds around our coast. All of them are edible. Some of them are certainly not worth eating. And there's been a long tradition of coastal people, seaweeds being part of their diet for time immemorial. Historically, the two seaweeds that were most widely eaten were carrageen moss. Carrageen means little rock in Gaelic, and the other one was dillisk or dulse. And I mean, there are lots in that family, as you know. So basically, people knew forever that it was used for two things. It was used for food, and it was also, of course, used for fertilizers. So people, local coastal communities would have always collected seaweed, particularly kelps, after a storm. The seaweed would be blown would accumulate in high mounds on the shore. People would rush down onto the coastline with their pitchforks to claim their amount of kelp, which of course, and then they would put a pitchfork in at either end of their mound of kelp, and God be with anybody who actually stole any of their kelp, because it was the only kind. They knew the importance of the kelp as a fertilizer and to activate the worm population in the soil, improve the soil fertility and everything. And still in Ireland, very strong belief that the very best potatoes, and you know how we love our potatoes, are grown with the introduction of kelp. Sadly, we live at Cotton Island, which is literally minutes from where we live in Shanagarry in East Cork, and we are virtually certainly the only farmers who now seaweed from the strand. We have a license to collect the seaweed after the storm. We send a front loader down, and we bring up to 500 tons of seaweed for our little 100-acre organic farm every year. Now, there are students from the cooking school. Students come from all over the world, and we, of course, learn how to cook and all of that. But we also introduce them to foraging, so they can identify edible food in the wild, but also seaweed. And so there they are, looking at the different kinds of seaweeds on the rocks. We're showing them how to identify the little carrageen. It's from the low rocks, and there it is. That's carrageen on the left-hand side. There. Now this one, when it's growing in the wild, it's a sort of purpley wine color, low growing, and as I mentioned a moment ago, the translation of the word carrageen from the Gaelic language, from Irish, is rock. So basically, the years ago, a very important part of people's income as well, actually, was to collect and to harvest the seaweed and to sell it. So what we bought seaweed from Ballymaloe House. We buy it from local collectors. There was a lovely old couple who lived in Ballyandraine, and they actually showed my mother-in-law, Myrtle Allen, the secret of how to collect the seaweed. They would collect it after the spring tides during the year, when the tides were furthest out and more of the rocks were exposed. And they'd pick it, bring it, and they'd spread it out on the spongy, grassy cliffs, and then it would be washed by the rain and bleached by the sun for about 10 days. Then they would collect it. It would look like it did there in 2 slides back, and it would then keeps forever. It's very, very light. As you know, it's a natural gelatine. There you are, carrageen, and it's also used in food production and all of that, and is registered. And basically, we in Ballymaloe, all of our Irish people knew the value of it from the health point of view, because of course it's full of minerals and vitamins and trace elements, zinc, and so it's very good for your chest. So if people have chest problems or whatever, they would make a carrageen syrup. But we also make a carrageen moss pudding. Now, why, you might say, what on earth is this slide here in front of you? But this is a slide of the sweet trolley at Ballymaloe House, which is, by the way, one of the top it's the sweet trolley in the world in the Restaurant Food Awards. But every single night, and the desserts change every night, but every single night there's carrageen moss on that. You see in the middle there, on the top layer, you can just about see little glass containers with white. That's the Carrigain
At the-
moss, which
at
we
the
make.
front.
That's it, front
Right,
there.
in front of the cheese
Yeah,
straws.
which you make as, and I'll get I can send you the recipe. I should have done it before this, actually, so you can put it up online. One of the big challenges of making a Carrigain moss pudding is to weigh it, because it's so light. And if you put too much in, it's like India rubber, and you'll wonder why you bothered. So you just put a little in, and then we serve it with softly whipped cream and soft brown sugar and whatever fruit is in season, from poached rhubarb to plums to green gooseberry, elderflower, whatever. On the right-hand side there is J.R. is the pastry chef at Ballymaloe, who's just written this Ballymaloe dessert book, actually, which these photographs came out of. There are lots of variations of different ways to different compotes to serve the Carrigain with. Anyway, basically, and all of our babies in the Allen family and in extended families are all weaned onto Carrigain. So we believe Carrigain, we know this Carrigain, or what's called in probably your part of the world, if you can buy it in health food shops or something, it's called Irish moss, actually. So that and the dusk were the two main ones that Irish people collected traditionally, but we also collect, there's also a wonderful other dillisk or thing which we call pepper dillisk, and this one it's called the truffle of the sea. Have you got that, Severine?
No, only on your side.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's like a little frond, like a little fern frond. It tastes of truffle. And I remember when Rennie Redzepi, this is proper name dropping now, when Rennie Redzepi of Noma was over for the Lit Fest a number of years ago, he thought he'd died and gone to heaven when he found it. We took him foraging, and because they were already great foragers, as you know, all the chefs from Noma, and he found this pepper dillisk and absolutely loved it. That can be picked to the low tides. You can nibble it raw or put it into something. And then the other ones, we collect quite a lot. There's another one called Corallina, and that grows in rock pools. Looks like a little floating coral. Reddish fronds. There was a slide up there a few minutes ago, and that is little tiny calcium deposits that give it a distinctive crunch. You can use that raw, and also particularly love that in with other seaweeds and salads with an Asian dressing. Sea lettuce is another one we collect, of course. Lava is another one we collect. They're very seasonal, and also sea spaghetti. They're the main ones, and the chefs, of course, are now there's tremendous new interest in Carrigain moss on the chefs, the top chefs as well, but also, needless to say, from the commercial possibilities. And that brings, in a few minutes, I can talk about the Irish government policy and the confusion around it at the moment, if you'd like me to.
We would.
Yes,
Yeah.
we would. Thank you.
Okay.
So that's the Irish example. And just to say this, going out in a small boat and bringing something into a small jar to be enjoyed as a sprinkle on your food is a very compelling path, and drew me all the way to remote little town in Maine, where I love to be in the water, in this tradition, which is not only in Ireland, it's also all over these coastlines. There you can see some sea lettuce in the bottom right corner, and a colander kelp with the little holes in it. As you can see, this is a substance which is beguiling, and then you become infatuated, you become obsessed. But so this is traditional mariculture and wild harvest, and then farming of seaweed takes place around the world, in Polynesia, in Southeast Asia, now increasingly in East Africa, in the Philippines, in Korea and Japan and China, in Hawaii. And so the question that we're bringing in this Seaweed Commons paper and in this conversation today is, how are we affirming the self-determination of smallholders in this space, and how, as a new class, as a freshman class of seaweed farmers are entering in the water, how are we building a culture of accountability? Because what you'll learn is that there has been a great intensification of seaweed culture around the world, and a scaling and a doubling and a tripling of the production of seaweeds for these delightful culinary products that you might know of in the form of nori. And then, of course, the alginates that are coming from the capophycus, the red seaweeds, the tropical seaweeds that are used in puddings and in bologna sandwiches and in commercially produced breads and inks and sausages and pie fillings. So where there is industrial food, there is the use of algae-derived alginates and carrageenan products that provides a mouthfeel, not just for the chefs, but also for these kind of yogurt-like products and meat-like products that you would buy in a plastic package in any bodega around the world. So we're interested in helping to explain some of that development here in this talk of what's kind of gone around the world. The traditional farms that grew up in Asia currently produce about 95% of the total seaweed in the world. And you can see that there's traditional use of materials, bamboo and floating wood, to create these kind of ephemeral structures. Ephemeral, especially when there's a typhoon and big waves are crashing through these systems and knocking the marine debris ashore. But you can see that this is very different. The distribution of these farms in Asia is much more advanced than anything we have in North America or in Europe, or indeed in New Zealand and South Africa and Chile. But the expansion and the proposed intensification of seaweed culture is very much on the table. And so it does us well to look at the information that we have about how seaweed farming is undertaken and governed around the world, and some of the challenges that have presented themselves in these kinds of coastal systems. So one in particular we would focus on is called exuded polystyrene, which is also known as styrofoam. So the biggest problem that exists in Asia now is caused a ban in the use of uncoated polystyrene, and major investment from the Korean government, especially in trying to replace this material, which breaks down and contaminates the shores of these remote islands. And of course, goes into microplastics, which get into all of marine life, and which carry with them dioxins and heavy metals. They actually attach, their little plastic attaches to other poisons and then enters into the bodies of all other creatures up the trophic ladder, and then of course also into human fish for human consumption. So this is an example of a kind of a problem that exists. And I'm happy to report that there are those of us who are very motivated by this problem to grow our algae farms, not with styrofoam, but with buoys made from hemp and mushroom mycelium, so that we have a biodegradable, bio-based, actually organically grown buoy. And we have been replicating the shapes of the Korean buoys, as well as growing them for our oyster cages. And you can learn more about that if you would like to follow it. Again, I just bringing up a few of the big topics. As this intensification and expansion of farming has occurred, there have not been adequate regulatory oversights developed to deal with the increase in disease and in epiphytic, which are kind of like the weeds of seaweed that grow on top of the farmed plants. These are mostly grown in monocultures. They're mostly grown in shallow waters that are warming, and they're grown, mostly by women. Although they do arrive into a global supply chain, the market price is quite low for most of the seaweed in the world for those who actually produce it. And so I think it's important to just keep in mind that the same things we learn about agriculture on land when you have these monocultures and intensification, you do increase disease. And the losses in China were in 2019 in Capaficus alone, that's the one on the right, another red seaweed, it was $400 million from the ice disease. You can see it's ice because it makes it look like ice. Other related kind of troubles in the world of algae, of course, is that human runoff from our over-fertilization in agriculture have caused these algae blooms to occur. The one on the right, it was 12,000 boats are deployed, hundreds of millions of yen are spent trying to cope with this essentially algae responding to an imbalance in the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle. And of course, that has impact on the small fishing fleet here in the Gambia, and of course on recreation and the health of city dwellers in China. So this is kind of like signals being sent by algae telling us that we've got to mend our ways. And this is where we're going to try to invite Sean, but if he's not here, then I'm going to just give his talk for him, because he's from Long Island, which is the peninsula jutting out that was beautiful soil scraped off of all of Canada and New England and dumped on this beautiful long island, which is also known for potato growing and now more known for over-fertilized lawns of the Hamptons. And as a consequence, we have really bad impact on the coastal waters with hypoxic zones, what they call rust tide, brown tide, mahogany tide, and red tide, all of which are overgrowths of bacteria and algae, which cause disease in animals and pets, and also impact the marine aquatic environment and cause a sludge and a suppression of oxygen. So those are understood to be major drivers of not health. These are not healthy occurrences. So there's a new conversation about how do we start growing kelp in places where we have too much coastal nitrogen and phosphorus, and then bring that nutrient cycle back into balance by using that resultant kelp as a fertilizer, into the terrestrial, metabolized, as if you wish, through farms. And so that's the work of Montauk Seaweed Company in New York, is bringing that kelp onto the land. And just again, for a global context, most of the land in the world is fertilized with synthetic fertilizers or mined fertilizers. Here you see a rock phosphate mine, which causes major impacts where it happens: radioactivity, water contamination, destruction of landscape. 70% of the rock phosphate in the world is in Morocco, but insignificant mining occurs also in Florida, in the US, and really terrible contamination in mining. And then, of course, those mined minerals are spread out. In the case of New Zealand, you can see this little dust cloud. That's from an airplane dusting these previously afforested hills, which are now dairy and sheep land, which are bred varieties to require lots of fertilizer. So if we can bring some of the nutrient from impacted coastlines onto these lands, that's a great avenue for positive intervention. And I just say, here's another thing you might not have known about, which is called float culture, where you have a bubbling tank and these algae, which can, so in their optimal conditions, can reproduce so quickly. So in New Zealand, where you have really bad impacts from this rock phosphate on water and cadmium in the soil and in the meat, and eutrophication in the rivers, and you can't swim in the rivers, there's now more and more research and effort to bring the river water and in the impacted waterways into algae systems, cleaning the water, and then harvesting the algae to be used in fertilizer. So again, these are modest scale regional approaches to water quality and nutrition that we want to just emphasize, that this is the kind of positive development that we are happy to, joyously transmit to you about, and that could use more people to do it. So now we're going to talk about some of the right-sized seaweed economy and how do we participate in in seaweed policy making. Maybe I'll go over to Amanda and then to Darina to kind of reflect on what the developments are in your regions in this regard. Yeah. Let's do Amanda and then Darina. Do you want to talk about what's going on in British Columbia?
Yeah. So, as was mentioned at the beginning, I live on Vancouver Island, which is a very large island off the west coast of British Columbia, Canada. And here we have the greatest cold water seaweed diversity known on the planet, with about 650 species of seaweed. We have huge, healthy, intact tracts of kelp forest here. So just to point out that this is a place really worth proceeding with caution when it comes to seaweed aquaculture. We also have healthy runs of wild salmon here too, as well as the critically endangered southern resident killer whales. So it's a place we really want to proceed with caution. So currently, nobody was farming seaweed here until probably about 5 or 6 years ago, other than Dr. Louis Droul, who was the first person to farm kelp outside of Asia, and he was doing more just figuring out how to do it and if it could be done sort of all the way back in the 80s. But now what we have is the seaweed farming hype. I mean, there's a lot of money being put into new companies, and I think that some of them have their sights set on the carbon offset market, which seaweed will be entering. Kelp farming will be entering that market probably any day now. So because there isn't a history of seaweed aquaculture in BC, there are essentially almost no regulations around it. There's no regulations on farm size. The only regulations around farm location have to do with the farms being a navigational hazard for ships. So, and there is some protection for eelgrass and rockfish habitat, but beyond that, there's no regulations around it. So we have a situation where right now we have a company that claims to be the largest seaweed farms in North America. That's their stated goal. And again, with BC not having really any regulations around the seaweed farming, one of our primary concerns is dilution of the wild seaweed genetics. As I mentioned, we have really large intact tracts of bull kelp forest, and a lot of the bull kelp forests, I forget the number, upwards of 80% of them disappeared in Northern California after we had the marine heat wave known as the blob. So really critical. And the problem, the issue with bull kelp, all kelp are sensitive to very small increases in ocean temperature, but bull kelp is especially sensitive because unlike all the other kelps, its reproductive part sits right at the surface. And if the reproductive cells are exposed to UV, that will kill them and they won't be able to reproduce. So bull kelp is especially sensitive to warming ocean temperatures. And if it's going to have any chance of adapting, it really needs to maintain its robust genetic diversity. Bull kelp has incredible localized population genetics. So we have bull kelps that are growing on the west side of Vancouver Island, where the water is cold all year round, the population genetics are very distinct from bull kelp that grows on the east side of Vancouver Island, where the water is an inland sea because it's sandwiched between Vancouver Island and the mainland of Canada. And we have no regulation in BC at all around native seed protection. So what we would like to see, and what they do have in Alaska, is that the seeds for a seaweed farm should be collected a maximum distance from where that farm is going to be, so that we're not diluting the population genetic diversity of the local seaweed. So right now we have about 2 or 3 seed producers for bull kelp, and that's just being spread out all over the place. So that's one of the main things, the main focuses. But there's also, being responsible for the farm debris when the farms are deactivated. What are the effects on migrating salmon if you have a 20-kilometer long farm that's right in their migratory route? The effects of shading, the effects of water attenuation. These are all impacts that we don't know because this industry is brand new. So we really believe that large-scale seaweed aquaculture should not move forward until the impacts on the wild ecosystem are known and shown to be minimal, as well as the socioeconomic impacts, because we have, these new companies with lots of money going into very economically vulnerable communities on our coast and making a lot of big promises that that really there isn't evidence that those promises are necessarily going to come to fruition. So that's just a snapshot of what's happening in BC right now.
Thank you, Amanda. That's
brilliant.
That's brilliant. Can I just ask a question? I mean, how far off do you think we are in getting proper scientific evaluation of the impact of this kind of farming, which before we can, which will help inform regulatory frameworks? Or is there not enough investment being put into this research? What's the situation there?
Yeah, well, that's sort of one of the projects of that the Seaweed Commons is sort of looking toward, is trying to get like a report similar to Europe's report, the SAM's policy brief, which Severine will probably mention in a bit. But it is really disappointing. The government, so there's such a similarity in BC to what we saw with salmon farming. So salmon farming came in, everyone was really excited. The government threw millions and millions of dollars at the industry. Fast forward to today, where we find out that salmon farming is killing all the wild, a lot of it's having a really detrimental effect on the wild salmon. So now the farms are being closed and people are losing their jobs and, blah, blah, blah. So fast forward, now it's the same thing with the seaweed farming. We have these big brand new companies that have zero history with seaweed at all, getting literally millions of dollars from both the provincial government and the federal government. And no, there's the government's, there's no research being done, nothing. Just hopefully it'll be, the government's like, hopefully this will be great. It's
well, and I would just add, I mean, it's millions, it's billions. So the carbon venture tech funding is estimated at $1.5 billion per quarter in 2022. So you have, Zuckerberg, you have Bezos, you have World Wildlife Fund, you have geoengineering proposals being made with, there's one company here in Maine called Running Tide, which is our kind of big new, that's funded by not Spotify, but Shopify. So you have companies who want to do offsets for their business to be net zero, putting in money to speculative techniques to sequester carbon, which haven't been proven and which are now coming under fire. Thankfully, we do have. There is pushback to this kind of investor-driven hype. There is responsiveness at the convention on biological diversity that was just taking place in Montreal. So there is starting to be awareness that, whoa, we need to be very careful with these mega proposals. But the proposals are very mega, and the pressure is very big, and the feedback loops are. It's much at stake. Reason we talked in the beginning about the role of algae in moderating the climate, cycling the nutrients, providing food for the entire marine ecosystem, having 1 billion years of evolutionary genetic history, in their bodies. When you start hearing about genetically engineered kelps and kelps for biofuel and free-floating upwellers in the ocean to pump cold water artificially up to create kelp for, it's a very speculative engineering with a system that is.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. And if I could just jump in for a second, the title of our talk today is "Seaweed is Already Saving the World," because we chose that because the media is saying seaweed is going to save the world. It's going to absorb all this carbon, and it's going to provide a nutrient-dense food source for expanding population, blah, blah. If we mess with the wild algae, we are messing with global climate. That needs to be the foundation before we start these, massive projects in the ocean without any knowledge of what that impact is going to be. So we want to proceed with caution.
One of the things that we could ask Darina to talk about is the seaweed harvesting in Ireland. In Ireland, it's the same as with and in Maine, the wild seaweed forests have been harvested for hundreds of years for fertilizer. And I know that there's been a pushback of that overharvest in recent years. Do you want to talk about what's going on in Ireland, Darina, with aspergillum?
Yeah, totally. And just back to using, I think Amanda just mentioned about the nutrient density of seaweed. It's a sort of general point, really. I think people years ago really knew that that iodine seaweed was high in iodine and potash, but we know nitrogen, phosphate, magnesium, etc. And it's just worth saying, I think, that in general, the seaweeds are infinitely more nutritious than anything that's grown on land. So in other words, in general, seaweed contains 10 times the mineral level of land-based plants, and particularly rich in iodine and in calcium. So that's a really kind of a little basic fact to keep. So in a way, all of us ought to try to incorporate some seaweed into our diets. Anyway, back to what's happening in Ireland. Well, now, interestingly, there's been, as I said, a long tradition of people going down to the coast and collecting some seaweeds themselves. In recent years, there's a growing realization of the riches that we have around our coast in Ireland. And some people have started to collect seaweed, harvest seaweed, mostly sort of sustainably, and then processing it, drying it, selling it for sprinkles to add things, etc. And they need a license for that. So the government, this is really, again, they're slightly asleep at the wheel in the beginning, and then didn't kind of really take much notice of what was going on. And then suddenly some Canadian companies started to eye up Ireland, because we have natural kelp forests as well, absolutely amazing kelp forests off Bantry. And then there was suddenly the local people realized that the government were selling off some of the seaweed rights, because those seaweed rights go back to the time of when we were part of Great Britain, the Crown rights, they call them. And basically, some of the local people suddenly realized what was happening and that the government was selling off seaweed rights to these Canadian companies. And so they went up in arms. And also this wonderful kelp forest off Bantry on the south coast of Ireland. One of them is on the west coast. Was Uder Austin a Gaeltacht that with the government that sold off the rights. At the moment, both of those cases are in court. So basically, they're being taken. The Irish government, I think, is taking. I'm not sure who's taking what, but anyway, the Irish government is trying to get out of the selling them to the Canadian company because there's such a furore about it. But I just before in preparation for this, and it was quite difficult after Christmas because a lot of the civil servants don't come back to work until some of the rest of us are already back at work, so it's difficult to get through to people. But I did speak to somebody who was head of the marine biology thing originally, and he told me that there's actually a lot of confusion about it. There's definitely a realization that we need to, immediately leap into action. Regulation is very badly needed. And actually, in the meantime, this goes back to 2018. One of the TDs, or one of the members of Parliament in Ireland, Minister for Housing and Rural, funnily, it was under the Minister for Housing and Urban Development. He was somehow or other got involved in the seaweed licensing thing, and he went out of his way to meet with a lot of the people who had concerns, really listened to them, and after that he guaranteed that people who had traditional rights to harvest seaweed would still be able to do it, and then obviously then acknowledged that we quickly need to get some proper licensing system in place. So at the moment, there are just two pathways to get a license. One is for hand harvesting, the other is an aquaculture license. Neither of them are particularly difficult to get, but certainly, just like you were saying, Amanda, there doesn't seem to be any, farm size. They're very little in the way of specifics at the moment. But there is definitely a realization of the urgency to get something, and they're watching. I mean, when I spoke to them about your document on Seaweed Commons, they said, "Oh yes, this is definitely one of the ways to go." They already had seen your document, by the way. And so that's kind of a little roundup of what's happening here at the moment. But there's definitely a growing understanding of what we have in Ireland, that we mustn't lose it. We also have this salmon fishery thing, which of course have had all these unintended consequences, not least the complete decimation of sea trout. Our sea trout, there are no more sea trout now. And so I think your point is very well made, that we need to learn from the mistakes of that industry and not leap straight in, as it sounds as though it's happening in some countries, and say, "Oh, this is going to be brilliant, let's just fund it." So I hope we can learn from each other and learn from the mistakes. But that's the position in Ireland at the moment. In theory, those of us who either forage just a little or show people how to forage from the seashore, we should have a license. But they're kind of they're turning a blind eye to just people taking a little. Well, not quite a blind eye, but they're not. So that's the position at the moment.
Thank you. We're almost up at time. So I think we're going to have to take the questions into the following Zoom. Probably.
Could we take
just to say, it's the same company, Darina, Acadia Sea Plants, though it's the same company that's harvesting in Ireland as is harvesting in Maine, and the increase in demand, especially when you have more and more greenhouse growing and marijuana, it's used in citrus, it's used by dairy, the wild seaweed forests, the ascophyllum forests that are being harvested are in massive demand to help remineralize soils that have been degraded by chemical fertilizers. And so again, the pressures are on many fronts, and I think that the passion and the tradition and the knowledge and the kind of eco-literacy of citizens who are then able to speak with a strong voice to raise these issues is really why we're having this session. And I want to, in the next Zoom, we're going to talk about you in the British Isles and in the community of the Real Food Conference. What are the next steps to take to activate that voice?
Yeah, I guess I think the red flags went up in Ireland when suddenly people who had traditionally gone down to the shore to collect carrageen or the other seaweeds every year were suddenly told by people you can't. This is no longer, you can no longer harvest here. And even though people had done traditionally. So I understand the thing, but I think Irish people objected to the fact that they didn't even know that these rights were up for sale. They're owned by the government, of course, all of the shoreline and so on, and that they would at least have for Irish people to have had an option to start to harvest and commercialize it, maybe on a smaller scale and so on. So
yeah, and in a UN context, that's called prior informed consent.
Yeah,
and when we're talking about Irish, but we're also talking about Inuit. We're also talking about First Nations peoples for whom this is millennial long. The navigation across the Bering Sea was in fact helped along by the kelp fronds that showed the way. So there's a lot at stake, and we hope that many of you will come into the next session, even if Darina can't. And we hope to see Darina on the next seaweed session with all these chefs that love seaweed. We got to make sure that they transmit some of this with their cultural power.
and I can send you the recipe if you tell me what to do about sending you the carrageen recipe, so we can share it with other people.
We can share it on our Instagram and send
and seaweed salads and all sorts of things that we do. We get the other students all fired up about the importance.
And Amanda has her classes that she runs. We have classes that we run. There's now actually great intertidal education all over that we can help you navigate.
Let's share our knowledge and share the classes.
We have no audience now, ladies.
Okay, but we'll see you in the Zoom now. But then just to say, Kathy and Darina, this is just the beginning.
I know, it's fantastic. Thank you both.
Thank you for doing it.
Darina.
Bye.
Thank you, Darina.